I don't know about you, but when I think about the PlayStation, one of the first things that comes to mind is RPGs. The PlayStation represents a point in time when Western console gamers finally caught on to the appeal of role-playing games, a genre that had thus far been popular largely on PC or in Japan. And while it was really Final Fantasy VII that would kickstart the 1990s RPG boom, as it's now known, the PlayStation wasn't exactly lacking in the genre prior to 1997 either. The console's first year saw the release of Arc the Lad and Beyond the Beyond, the former launching its own franchise, and the latter forming the basis for the Golden Sun games. But for me personally, I think the first truly excellent RPG released for PlayStation was Suikoden. Suikoden, sometimes referred to as Genso Suikoden, follows the son of Tio McDole, a high-ranking general of the Scarlet Moon Empire, who seeks to follow in his father's footsteps. As he becomes more and more involved with the Empire's dealings, however, the young man starts to question the actions and morals of the Emperor and his generals, including his father.
Are we the baddies?
When his best friend Ted is fatally wounded by the Empire, McDole is entrusted with the powerful and terrible Soul Eater rune, for which Ted gave his life to keep out of the Empire's hands. The McDole boy is soon labeled a fugitive, and joining the efforts of an underground resistance, he finds himself forming his own army from the ground up in an effort to finally bring a stop to the cruel and power-hungry Empire. In terms of presentation, Suikoden very much feels like a middle ground between 16 and 32 bits. Audibly, the game is a real leap from the JRPGs of the SNES. The soundtrack is all pre-recorded thanks to the CD-ROM format, and the game also makes use of stereo audio for environmental ambiance, such as these fountains in Gregminster Castle's courtyard, which get louder or quieter in the corresponding speaker depending on distance and position. Graphically, 3D and polygons are left very minimal here, with much of the game presented via high-quality 2D sprites. Battles are given 3D polygonal backgrounds that allow for sweeping cinematic camera movements. You're even allowed to control the camera yourself once you get a certain key item late in the game. And there are snazzy spell animations that make use of some 3D graphical tricks, but otherwise things are kept fairly traditional. According to interviews, this was a decision made because the game's dev team were somewhat unimpressed by the PlayStation's 3D capabilities, and so they decided to just stick to the tried and true. While I'm sure that may have disappointed audiences at the time, in retrospect, I feel like this has helped the game stand the test of time when compared to other first-year PlayStation titles. The sprite and background art for this game is all great, although I will say that your character's walk cycle feels a bit under-animated. He really only moves his legs and arms when walking. His head and torso remain completely static. True, that is basically a one-to-one translation of how 16-bit RPGs would animate walk cycles, but with how much more detailed the character sprites became with this new generation, that just really doesn't seem to cut it here. Over time, it was something I got used to, but come on, man, lean forward, bend your knees, something. What is this stupid little penguin waddle you're doing, bro? But by far, the biggest reason I'll defend the developer's decision to make the game 90% 2D is because it meant Suikoden was able to have practically no load times. On the PlayStation, this almost seems like wizardry. Outside of a half-minute or so sequence of load screens whenever you resume a save, no transition in the game will ever take longer than a second or two. Screen transitions, story scenes, and even random battles popping up will always happen seamlessly. And this gives the entire game an incredibly snappy pace that many later PlayStation RPGs would sacrifice in their pursuit of cutting-edge graphical prowess. Also contributing to that snappy pacing is the game's battle system. In function, Suikoden is a traditional turn-based RPG, here featuring parties of up to 6 characters organized into 2 rows. You select your character's actions all at once, and then watch them play out according to each member's speed stat, as is standard for the genre, but here that age-old process is made more dynamic by having characters take their turns in tandem rather than one at a time. Characters that aren't targeting the same enemy or casting a spell will perform their attacks at the same time, which livens up what is traditionally a somewhat slow and flat style of battle into a more swift and thrilling form of action and movement. For basic physical attacks, each party member is designated as a short, mid, or long-range fighter depending on their preset weapon types. Short-range fighters are only effective in the front row, mid-range fighters can attack from either row but can only hit enemies in front, and long-range fighters can hit any target from any position. Depending on the combination of characters in your current party, certain pairs can also use special Unite abilities to attack entire enemy groups or fire off a powerful combo attack. Magic spells and certain special abilities are granted by equipable runes that can be swapped out at runemaster shops. Elemental runes grant up to 4 spells of the associated element, operating on the Vancian system of spell charges that increase as characters level up. There are also non-elemental or special runes that either grant the character a unique command, such as a double strength attack at the cost of some cooldown time, or passive abilities such as increased EXP or money gain. There's even a rune capable of repelling random battles, and as well as full runes, there are also rune pieces, which can be permanently grafted onto a character's weapon to enhance its stats. To escape from battle, the game offers the player 2, though technically 3, options. There's the typical run command, but also the bribe command, wherein the player can attempt to pay the enemy off to be left alone. Both of these have a chance of failure, however. Running may fail if the enemy party is too strong, and lowballing an enemy with too little money can result in them lashing out at you instead. At points where your party's average level surpasses that of the enemy party, the run command is replaced with the let go command, which is functionally the same except that it has a 100% success rate. There's also the free will command, this game's version of auto battle, which just sets everybody to attack physically for the current turn, to save you some time and a handful of button inputs. There is no shared item inventory in Suikoden. Instead, each party member has a personal inventory of 9 items that they can carry, and this includes armor and accessories. With 6 character parties, this can be more generous than it sounds. That's a total of 54 item slots on hand. Once the player reaches a certain point in the story, McDole gains ownership of a small island that acts as a base in which to build his army, and various characters can be recruited to join, 108 in total. Over time, and assuming you recruit the right members, your headquarters eventually gains all the amenities you could ever need, including a storehouse in which to dump excess items for later use, and various shops to buy and sell as needed. Your headquarters really forms the center of Suikoden. The game revolves around building your personal army, and the more you recruit, the more resources you have at your fingertips. Of course, many of the recruits act as additional party members, but there are several that serve utility roles, like shopkeepers, rune masters, innkeepers, or even those that allow you to change the game's window or sound effect settings. You also gain a progressively better series of blacksmiths that can level up your weapons to a maximum of 16. Unlike armor and other items, weapons don't take up an inventory slot, but are instead fixed to each character, viewable on their status screens, and upgrading weapons enough times may cause them to take new forms. Hey look it, a Metal Gear reference. Neat. Suikoden is also the first RPG I've played since like the 8-bit era where money management actually feels like an important major element again. With around 80 playable party members, each with their own unique weapons to maintain, keeping up on everybody's equipment becomes incredibly pricey. Upgrading weapons becomes exponentially more expensive with each level. Moving from level 2 to level 3 only costs a few hundred bits, but by the time you get to level 16, you're spending 70,000 bits per weapon. The prices for high-quality armor also become similarly exorbitant, and while you can swap armor from inactive characters to save you some money, that process can be cumbersome and time-consuming. And that's really my biggest complaint with Suikoden. It's not a long game on the surface, probably only around 15 hours of actual content to speak of, but I easily stretched that out to around twice that length solely due to all the time spent managing my party and inventory. While there's never any obligation to swap your entire party out, you can stick to 1 or 2 favorites for most of the game if you want to, every chapter of the story requires 3 or even 4 specific members be included in your party. And if those are characters you've never used before, that means getting each one caught up on weapon levels and equipment. You also have to be careful that your current rows aren't thrown off by the current selection of characters. I'll admit that I did swap new characters into my party more than was necessary, but in a game with 80 playable characters, I felt like I needed to try out at least most of them, right? But the process of swapping equipment between characters can be mind-numbing, even with a well-stocked headquarters with all the necessary NPCs. Single items can only be swapped between characters while they're in your current party, otherwise you can only dump their entire inventory into the storehouse all at once. Your headquarters also grows to be a pretty hefty multi-floor complex, with useful NPCs not always placed in the most convenient locations. They did a pretty good job of having the most commonly used amenities all placed in the center, but they're still scattered among multiple floors. So if I want to change character in my party, I need to go to the 2nd floor to dump all the items from the character I'm removing, go to the 4th floor to swap characters, go back to the 2nd floor to see which leftover equipment the new member can use, go to the 1st floor to equip runes and buy any armor they're still lacking, and then go back to the 2nd floor again to dump any excess items that may remain. Oh, and then go back to the inn on the 1st floor to save my game. I do love the base building aspect of Suikoden, but I can't help but feel like there could have been ways to streamline this whole process. And this is all assuming I even have the funds to get everything the characters need. While I do appreciate that money actually feels like it matters here, the fastest way, though not necessarily the most reliable way, to earn money in Suikoden is via gambling, and so I spent a lot of time in this game gambling. So much gambling. In all fairness, it's safe to say that you're not actually expected to play the game the way I did. Keeping up on all of your equipment for every character is unreasonably costly and time-consuming, and really not worth it for any but the most obsessive of completionists. And with so many playable party members, it's important that the game makes sure no one character ever falls too far behind. Characters in Suikoden level up at a flat rate of 1000 EXP per level, but the actual EXP gain is awarded on a curve. Basically, the closer a character is in level to the enemies currently being fought, the less EXP they get, and vice versa. EXP is earned on a per-enemy basis and split between the entire current party. A character who is the same level as the enemies being fought will only gain around 200 EXP per enemy, so about 33 EXP after everyone gets their share. But if a character is, say, 15 levels lower than the current enemy, they'll gain a whopping 10,000 EXP, which, even when split 6 ways, is still a free level up, and that's just from a single enemy. This means rookie characters never have to wait long to catch up to your stronger party members, since punching above their weight class can result in a character gaining 5, 8, even 10 levels in a single fight. This built-in grading curve also acts as a good way to make sure the player is never over-leveled either. This not only helps in difficulty balancing, but it also means I never had to feel guilty about grinding out certain enemies for rare item drops. And the game's Let Go option even acts as a good indicator to the player of whether a certain enemy encounter will be worth their trouble. The Let Go command replaces the Run command only once the player party's level average surpasses the enemy party's level average. And since the XP gain becomes negligible once the player is stronger than the monsters, choosing to let weak enemies go saves you the time and trouble you'd maybe prefer not to spend over a few paltry experience points. In Suikoden, you never have to wonder if you're at risk of being too weak for the next area's enemies, because the Let Go option will tell you when you're caught up to the current ones. That said, those moments where the difficulty does spike can be pretty brutal. Saving can only be done at inns or at dedicated save points, and although the game's world map is walled off into certain segments throughout the story, every time you cross a threshold from one area to the next, there's an immediate and obvious jump in enemy strength. Now, this probably isn't too much of an issue for players who stick to the same handful of characters for the whole game, but I was swapping in new party members fairly often for the sake of variety, and so entering a new section of the map with a fresh low-level character was always a coin toss on whether all my party members would make it through alive. And even when I had a party up to snuff, there were two bosses in particular that tripped me up pretty badly: the Zombie Dragon and Necklord. Although thankfully continuing from a game over will keep all of the EXP you gain in the interim. For much of the game though, the resources for restoring KO'd party members are pretty scarce. A character carrying a sacrificial Buddha will automatically be revived in the event of a KO, but each Buddha is one-time use only, and they can't be purchased on demand until the game's second half. And as for using magic to revive party members, the Resurrection rune that grants you revival spells is only available as a rare drop from some fairly late-game monsters. Throughout a lot of the early game, you're going to be relying almost entirely on inns to revive KO'd characters. And the characters. 108 seems like a very specific choice of number, doesn't it? Suikoden's director, Yoshitaka Murayama, says that the game's central concept was inspired by the famous 14th century Chinese novel, The Water Margin, a story about a group of 108 outlaws that band together to form an army, eventually earning amnesty from their government. The title, Suikoden, is derived from the kanji used to spell the novel's title, which in Japan can be read as Suikoden. The number 108 holds spiritual significance in a number of Eastern religions. For instance, in Buddhism, they represent the 108 earthly temptations one must overcome in order to achieve nirvana. Here in Suikoden, each of the so-called 108 Stars of Destiny are represented by a recruitable party member or NPC. Interestingly, the game's base-building mechanic was a result of the 108 characters idea, not the other way around. Giving the player a base of operations meant the game designers wouldn't need all 108 characters to be playable, as they could instead have some of them serve strictly utility or story-related purposes. A notable example is a pair of NPCs who combine to form the game's fast travel system. One will warp you to any location you've already visited, and once you acquire a specific key item, keeping it on your person will allow the other NPC to instantly bring you back to headquarters from anywhere on the world map. It may not be the most elegant or flashy fast travel I've seen in a video game, but it's certainly practical. Some recruitable characters join over the course of the story, but many have to be sought out, and require that the player meet some sort of prerequisite or complete a side quest first. A few also have fairly tight windows within which to recruit them before they're gone forever. Some characters will only join up once McDowell has reached a certain level, or need to be convinced to join by specific other characters first. There are even a few points in the story where you can permanently lose your chance at a recruit due to your actions or dialogue decisions, and missing even a single character will prevent you from seeing the game's true ending. And the game really likes giving you dialogue options. Suikoden's lead character is largely a silent protagonist, with his only written lines being the ones you choose yourself. Normally these don't mean much. Certain options will usually only result in additional exposition, or are joke answers meant to add humor to the situation. You know that dialogue loop thing that some RPGs do, where they clearly offer you a wrong choice, but picking that one will just have a character go, "Oh, young master, you're so silly. Please, stop fooling around and choose the right answer." Yeah, Suikoden does that a lot, but those moments pay off during the few instances where those decisions do actually matter. In one such case, after defeating an enemy general, you're offered the choice to recruit him into your army as one of the 108 Stars of Destiny, or you can choose to kill him instead. You may decide to choose the second option as a lark, thinking that it's just like all the other clearly wrong answers and that the game won't actually let you go through with it. But it does. If you pick that option, you kill that character without ever recruiting him. He's gone forever. Your decision actually had a long-term consequence. The game spent hours conditioning you to expect certain outcomes from these dialogue decisions, and then suddenly subverted those expectations at a very critical moment. And just like that, suddenly you find yourself second-guessing every single joke answer from that point on. At certain points in the story, you'll engage in one of two special types of battles: war battles and duels. War battles see two armies fighting to reduce the other's numbers by trying to guess their next move with bow, magic, and charge attacks that operate on a rock-paper-scissors wheel. At the beginning of each turn, you can choose to call upon certain characters to use special abilities or bestow helpful effects on your troops, such as predicting what the opponent's next move will be, or increasing the power of one of the three attack types. It's important to approach these battles with caution, as performing poorly in them can result in characters permanently dying. Duels are much less common. There are only 3 in the entire game, but they're also much more personal. All 3 of these battles take place at pivotal dramatic moments in the story, such as when the McDowell son finally confronts his father for the first time since turning his back on the Empire. These are similar to war battles in that they operate on rock, paper, scissors, but duels are fought one-on-one, with each character's goal being to predict their opponent's next move, to break through their advance, and deplete their HP to 0. 2 of these battles will simply result in a game over should the player lose, but one specific duel will result in another permanent character death if the player doesn't succeed. There is also one specific character death that's unavoidable over the course of the story, however it can be undone just before the end of the game, but only if you manage to recruit and keep the other 107 characters. Death and loss also play heavily into the story's themes, most literally in the form of the Soul Eater rune entrusted to our lead character, which grows stronger every time he loses someone important to him. By the end of the game, our hero's spirit seems to have been almost completely broken, with the 2 visits to Gregminster that bookend the game's story seeming to reflect the main character's opinion of the Empire over time. At the start of the game, the city is bright and pristine and full of friendly NPCs, but when you return at the end, now aware of the full scope of the Emperor's atrocities, it's very dull, dry, and lifeless, with the background music replaced by harsh blowing wind. The English localization for the game is serviceable, if a bit bare bones. A few typos here and there, and some humorous cases of mistranslated English. There's the requisite mixing up of L's and R's in the form of Galm and Fenril, and what's supposed to be the Mangosh dagger is spelled out phonetically as Mangosh, although I can't particularly blame them for that last one. French is really dumb. But I never found myself confused by the in-game script or anything, so all things considered, they didn't screw things up too badly. I'm also a bit surprised to see that this game pulled an all-ages rating in the US. The English script isn't shy about swears and killing and innuendo, and the game also features gambling. I'm just going to chalk that up to the fact that the ESRB had only been established about a year or so prior. Hell, it wasn't even called an E rating yet. It was called K through A. More so worthy of note, though, is the reimagined English cover for the game, which is... I mean, even for the time, this seems a bit archaic, right? When you compare it to the Japanese cover, it's like they went out of their way to make the American cover the polar opposite. And moreover, I'm not entirely sure that 1980s B-tier fantasy novel is really the vibe that they should have been marketing the game on. I'm also not sure why it comes packaged in a dual-layer jewel case despite only being one disc. I know that early PlayStation releases used these long box covers before they switched to standard jewel cases, and so maybe this was just an awkward transitionary period. Plus, if it means that the manual can retain the Japanese cover art, I'm not about to complain. And speaking of the manual, it's got some real heft to it, which is something I really miss in the modern era of gaming. It lists all of the game's runes and all 108 Stars of Destiny, as well as short character bios for the more major players of the Liberation Army. The first couple pages also really shed some light on how long it took for the idea of memory cards to latch onto the general market. About half a page is spent explaining, no, guys, seriously, you'll need a memory card if you want to save your game. We really cannot stress this enough. Suikoden's development was a troubled one. It was led by a two-person team made up of a rookie game designer and young artist. Murayama had gotten his job at Konami straight out of college and was only there for 6 months before being assigned to lead a new game. The project was born in the aftermath of a scrapped Konami console. Before Sony came along, Konami was planning to throw their hat into the console race alongside Sega and Nintendo, but plans were eventually scrapped. When Konami shifted to developing for PlayStation instead, they initially only assigned 10 employees to the division, spread across 5 different games. Murayama and artist Junko Kawano were at their wits' end coming up with all the game's concepts and designs almost entirely by themselves, before Konami finally folded the rest of the PlayStation division together to work on the game. The budget was also far too small to meet the team's lofty ambitions, and to make matters worse, once the game was finally finished, a massive game-breaking bug was discovered that the team needed to work tirelessly to fix at the last minute. In spite of this, Suikoden's messy dev cycle thankfully does not reflect in the final product. A Saturn port was released in Japan nearly 3 years later, which featured a bunch of new side quests, as well as a less lazy opening FMV. Unfortunately, the quality of the port itself was fairly spotty, with probably the biggest deal-breaker being that this version had pretty frequent and noticeable load times. With the way battles have these seamless transitions on PlayStation, it's definitely disappointing to see the Saturn version plagued by a bunch of blank black loading screens in their place. Another Japan-only re-release of Suikoden would come in 2006 for the PSP, this time also paired with its sequel. This version included updated menu layouts, an unlockable bonus gallery, and the ability to walk diagonally. Reviews of the time were a bit mixed, but generally positive. The most common points of contention were the game's under-ambitious graphics and somewhat lax difficulty, but most reviewers agreed the game was overall pretty fun and had some unique ideas. EGM awarded it runner-up for RPG of the Year behind Legacy of Kain, noting that it was a very close race. At the very least, it was considered a decent warm-up during the wait for the much-anticipated Final Fantasy VII, and over time, Suikoden would eventually earn its status as a cult classic of the genre. Perhaps the most flattering praise of Suikoden, though, comes from one Warren Spector. Yes, creator of System Shock and Deus Ex, Warren Spector. He considers Suikoden one of his favorite games, and it's even influenced him in the games he's worked on since. He especially praised the game's base-building element, as well as the way it handles player choice. Most dialogue options only offer the illusion of choice, but the few that actually matter really stand out as a result. Suikoden may not be the most complex or challenging RPG out there, but it is a very solid and entertaining one. And with the Suikoden 1 and 2 HD remaster set to release early next year, there is really no better time to try it out for yourself.